Before we plunge into tonight's final depths, a quick word from our wild new sponsor, Grizzly Gum. Let's watch.
Folks, nothing beats that fresh wilderness breath like new Grizzly Gum. Pop one and after a long hike, minty power that'll make you smile.
Share the fresh with nature's friends. Even the bears love it!
Grizzly Gum, tough, bold, and oh so refreshing.
Wait, what's that? Easy there, big fella. Still minty fresh, right? No, Grizzly Gum fights bad breath no matter what! Even in a real attack.
It's tough enough for the wild. Help! Cut that!
We apologize for this unaired footage.
Oh, no, folks, I am so sorry. That was absolutely the wrong tape. We were supposed to have a nice calm sponsor spot, but somehow we got the raw, unreleased Grizzly Gum carnage. My deepest apologies. I promise the team is getting an earful backstage. No bears were harmed, I hope. Let's quickly move on before things get any wilder. Clearing the chaos. Good evening, Watchers of the Waves, and welcome to the Series 1 finale arc of Hitchcock's Tales That Terrified, Shadows from the Master on SL tonight. Diving into the Master's deepest curated dread, concluding our anthology with John Wyndham's full novel Out of the Deeps. From ironic packs, we surface fireballs from the deep, the opening phase of this invasion epic. Broadcasters Mike and Phyllis Watson witness strange fireballs falling into the ocean worldwide, initially explained as meteors, but patterns emerge. They target the deepest trenches, vanishing without trace. As reports mount, subtle unease grows. Something intelligent lurks below. Wyndham's cozy catastrophe builds quiet terror through ordinary eyes. Hitchcock's legacy embraced such speculative chills. His TV show adapted evasion tales, which, while his fears of the unknown shaped the birds. This finale honors that submerged suspense. Watch the skies, the story, descent. Phase 1. I'm a reliable witness, you're a reliable witness. Practically all God's children are reliable witnesses in their own estimation, which makes it funny how such different ideas of the same affair get about. Almost the only people I know who agree word for word on what they saw on the night of July 15th are Phyllis and I, and as Phyllis happens to be my wife, people said in their kindly way behind our backs that I over-persuaded her. A thought that could proceed only from someone who did not know Phyllis. The time was 11:15 p.m. The place, latitude 35, sun 24 degrees west of Greenwich. The ship, Guinevere. The occasion, our honeymoon. About these facts there is no dispute. The cruise has taken us to Madeira, the Canaries, Cape Verde Islands, and then turned north to show us the Azores on our way home. We, Phyllis and I, were leaning on the rail, taking a breather. From the saloon came the sound of the dance continuing and the crooner yearning for somebody. The sea stretched in front of us like a silken plain in the moonlight. The ship sailed as smoothly as if she were on a river. We gazed out silently at the infinity of sea and sky. Behind us, the crooner went on baying. I'm so glad I don't feel like him. It must be devastating, Phyllis said. Why do you suppose people keep on mass-producing these dreary moanings? I had no answer ready for that one, but I was saved the trouble of trying to find one when her attention was suddenly caught elsewhere. Mars is looking pretty angry tonight, isn't he? I hope it isn't an omen, she said. I looked where she was pointing at the red spot among the myriad of white ones, and with some surprise, Mars does look red. Of course, though I'd never seen him look quite as red as that. But then neither were the stars, as seen at home, quite as bright as they were here. Being practically in the tropics might account for it. Certainly a little inflamed, I agreed. We regarded the red point for some moments. Then Phyllis said, "That's funny, it seems to be getting bigger." I explained that it was obviously a hallucination formed by staring at it. We went on staring and it became quite indisputably bigger. "Moreover, there's another one. There can't be two Marses," said Phyllis. And sure enough, there was. A smaller red point a little up from and to the right of the first. She added, "And another one to the left. See?" She was right about that too. And by the time the first one was glowing as the most noticeable thing in the sky. "It must be a flight of jets of some kind, and that's a cloud of luminous exhaust we're seeing," I suggested. We watched all three of them slowly getting brighter and also sinking lower in the sky until they were a little above the horizon line and reflecting in a pinkish pathway across the water towards us. "5 now," said Phyllis. We've both of us been asked many times since to describe them, but perhaps we're not gifted with such a precise eye for detail as some others. What we said at the time, and what we will still say, is that on this occasion there was no real shape visible. The center was solidly red, and a kind of fuzz around it was like so. The best suggestion I can make is that you imagine a brilliantly red light as seen in a fairly thick fog, so that there is a strong halation and you will have something of the effect. Others beside ourselves were leaning over the rail, and in fairness I should perhaps mention that between them they appear to have seen cigar shapes, cylinders, discs, ovoids, and inevitably saucers. We did not. What is more, we did not see 8 or 9 or a dozen. We saw 5. The halation may or may not have been due to some kind of jet drive, but it did not indicate any great speed. Things grew in size quite slowly as they approached. There were time for people to go back into the saloon and fetch their friends out to sea, so that presently a line of us leaned all against the rail, looking at them and guessing. With no idea of scale, we could have no judgment of their size or distance. All we could be sure of was that they were descending in a long glide, which looked as if it would take them across our wake. When the first one hit the water, a great burst of steam shot up in a pink plume. Then, swiftly, there was a lower, wider spread of steam which had lost the pink tinge, and was simply a white cloud in the moonlight. It was beginning to thin out when the sound of it reached us in a searing hiss. The water around the spot bubbled and seethed and frothed. When the steam drew off, there was nothing to be seen there but a patch of turbulence gradually subsiding. Then the second of them came in just the same way, on almost the same spot. One after another, all 5 of them touched down on the water with great whooshes and hissing of steam. Then the vapor cleared, showing only a few contiguous patches of troubled water. Aboard the Guinevere, the bells clanged, the beat of the engines changed. We started to change our course. Crews turned out to man the boats. Men stood by to throw lifebelts. 4 times we steamed slowly back and forth across the area, searching. There was no trace whatever to be found. But for our own wake, the sea lay all about us in the moonlight, placid, empty, unperturbed. The next morning I sent my card in to the captain. In those days I had a staff job with the EBC, and I explained to him that they would be pretty sure to take a place for me on the previous night's affair. He gave the usual response. "You mean BBC." The EBC was comparatively young then. People long accustomed to the BBC's monopoly of the British air were still finding it difficult to become used to the idea of a competitive radio service. Life would have been a great deal simpler, too, if somebody had not had the idea in the early days of sailing as near the wind as possible by calling us the English Broadcasting Company. It was one of those pieces of foolishness that became more difficult to undo as time goes on, and led continually to one explaining as I did now, not the BBC, the EBC. Ours is the largest all-British commercial radio network, etc. And when I was through with that, I added, "Our news service is stickler for accuracy, and as every passenger has his own version of this business, I hope you would let me check mine against your official one." He nodded approval of that. "Go ahead and tell me yours," he invited me. When I had finished, he showed me his own entry in the wall. Substantially, we were agreed, certainly in the view that there had been 5, and on the impossibility of attributing a definitive shape to them. His estimates of speed, size, and position were, of course, technical matters. I noticed that they had registered on the radar screens and were tentatively assumed to have been aircraft of an unknown type. What is your own private opinion? I asked him. Did you ever see anything at all like them before? No, I never have, he said, but he seemed to hesitate. But what? I asked. Well, but not for the record, he said. I've heard of 2 instances almost exactly similar in the last year. One time it was 3 of the things by night, the other it was half a dozen of them by daylight. Even so, they seemed to have looked much the same, just kind of a red fuzz. They were in the Pacific, though, not over this side. Why not for the record? In both cases, there were only 2 or 3 witnesses, and it doesn't do a seaman any good to get a reputation for seeing things. You know, the stories just get around professionally, so to speak. Among ourselves, we aren't quite as skeptical as landsmen. Some funny things can still happen at sea now and then. You can't suggest an explanation I can quote. On professional grounds, I'd prefer not. I'll just stick to my official entry. But reporting it is a different matter this time. We've a couple 100 witnesses and more. Do you think it'd be worth a search? You got the spot pinpointed? He shook his head. It's deep there, over 3,000 fathoms. That's a long way down. There wasn't any trace of wreckage in those other cases either. No, that would have been evidence to warrant an inquiry, but they had no evidence. We talked a little longer, but I could not get him to put forward any theory. Presently, I went away and wrote up my account. Later, I got through to London and dictated it to the EBC recorder. It went out on the air the same evening as a filler, just as an oddity which was not expected to do more than raise a few eyebrows. So it was by chance that I was witness of that early stage, almost the beginning, for I have not been able to find any references to identical phenomena earlier than those 2 spoken of by the captain. Even now, years later, though I am certain enough in my own mind that this was the beginning, I can still offer no proof that it was not an unrelated phenomenon. What the end that will eventually follow this beginning may be, I prefer not to think too closely. I would also prefer not to dream about it either. The dreams were within my control. It began so unrecognizably, had it been more obvious, and yet it's difficult to see what had been done effectively even if we had recognized the danger. Recognition and prevention don't necessarily go hand in hand. We recognized the potential dangers of atomic fission quickly enough, yet we could do little about them. If we had attacked immediately, well, perhaps, but until the danger was well established, we had no means of knowing that we should attack, and then it was too late. However, it does no good to cry over our shortcomings. My purpose is to give as good a brief account as I can of how the present situation arose, and to begin with, it arose very scrappily. In due course, the Guinevere docked at Southampton without being treated to any more curious phenomena. We did not expect any more, but the event had been memorable, almost as good, in fact, as having been in a position to say, upon some remote future occasion. When your grandmother and I were on our honeymoon, we saw a sea serpent, though not quite. Still, it was a wonderful honeymoon. I'd never expected to have a better, and Phyllis said something to much the same effect as we leaned on the rail, watching the bustle below. Except, she nodded, that I don't see why we shouldn't have one nearly as good now and then. So we disembarked, sought our brand new home in Chelsea, and I turned up at the EBC offices the following Monday morning to discover that in absentia I had been rechristened Fireball Watson. This was on account of the correspondence. They handed it to me in a large sheaf and said that since I had caused it, I had better do something about it. One letter referring to a recent experience off the Philippines, I identified with fair certainty as being a confirmation of what the captain of the Guinevere had told me. 1 or 2 others seemed worth following up too, particularly a rather cagey approach which invited me to meet the writer at La Plume's door, where lunch is always worth having. I kept that appointment a week later. My host turned out to be a man 2 or 3 years older than myself who ordered 4 glasses of Tio Pepe, then opened up by admitting that the name under which he had written was not his own, and that he was a flight lieutenant, RAF. It's a bit tricky, you see, he said. At the moment I am considered to have suffered some kind of hallucination, but if enough evidence turns up to show that it was not a hallucination, then you're almost certain to make it an official secret. Awkward, you see. I agree that it must be. Still, he went on, the thing worries me, and if you're collecting evidence, I'd like you to have it, though maybe not to make direct use of it. I mean, I don't want to find myself on the carpet. I nodded understandingly. He went on. It was about 3 months ago. I was flying one of the regular patrols, a couple 100 miles or so east of Formosa. I didn't know I began. There are a number of things that don't get publicity, though they're not particularly secret, he said. Anyway, there I was. The radar picked these things up when they were still out of sight behind me, but coming up fast from the west. He had decided to investigate and climbed to intercept. The radar continued to show the craft on a straight course behind and above him. He tried to communicate but couldn't raise them. By the time he was getting the ceiling of them, they were in sight as 3 red spots, quite bright, even by daylight, and coming up fast, though he was doing close to 500 himself. He tried again to radio them, but without success. They just kept on coming, steadily overtaking him. Well, he said, I was there to patrol. I told base that they were a complete unknown type of craft, if they were craft at all, and as they wouldn't talk, I proposed to have a pip at them. It was either that or just let them go, in which case I might as well not have been patrolling at all. Base agreed, kind of cautiously. I tried them once more, but they didn't shake a damn bit of notice of either me or my signals. And as they got closer, I was doubtful whether they were craft at all. They were just as you said on the radio, a pink fuzz with a deeper red center. Might have been a miniature red suns for all I could tell. Anyway, the more I saw of them, the less I liked them, so I set the guns to radar control and let them get on ahead. I reckon I must have been doing 700 or more as they passed me. A second or two later, the radar picked up the foremost one and the guns fired. There wasn't any lag. The thing seemed to blow up almost as the guns went off, and boy did it blow. It suddenly swelled immensely, turning from red to pink to white, but still with a few red spots here or there, and then my aircraft hit the concussion and maybe some of the debris too. I lost quite a lot of seconds and probably had a lot of luck, because when I got sorted out, I found that I was coming down fast. Something had carried away 3/4 of my starboard wing and messed up the tip of the other. So I reckoned it was time to try the ejector, and rather to my surprise, it worked. He paused reflectively. Then he added, I don't know that it gives you a lot besides confirmation, but there are 1 or 2 points. One is that they are capable of traveling a lot faster than those you saw. Another is that, whatever they are highly vulnerable. And that, as we talked it over in detail, was about all the additional information he could provide. That, and the fact that when they hit, they did not disintegrate into sections, but exploded completely, which should perhaps have conveyed more than it seemed to at the time. During the next few weeks, several more letters trickled in without adding much, but then it began to look as if the whole affair were going away the Loch Ness Monster. What there was came to me because it was generally conceded at EBC that fireball stuff was my pigeon. Several observatories confessed themselves puzzled by detecting small red bodies traveling at high speeds, but were extremely guarded in their statement. None of the newspapers really played it because, in editorial opinion, the whole thing was suspect of being too similar to the flying saucer business, and their readers would prefer more novelty in their sensation. Nevertheless, bits and pieces did slowly accumulate, though it did take nearly 2 years before they acquired serious publicity and attention. This time it was a flight of 13. The radar station in the north of Finland picked them up first, estimating their speed as 1,500 miles per hour, and their direction is approximately southwest. In passing the information on, they described them simply as unidentified aircraft. The Swedes picked them up as they crossed their territory and managed to spot them visually, describing them as small red dots. Norway confirmed, but estimated the speed at under 1,300 miles per hour. Scottish station logged them as traveling at thousands of miles per hour and just visible to the naked eye. 2 stations in Ireland reported them as passing directly overhead on a line slightly west of southwest. A more southerly station gave their speed at 800 and claimed that they were clearly visible. A weather ship at about 65 degrees north gave a description which tallied exactly with that of the earlier fireballs and calculated a speed close to 500. They were not sighted again. There was a sudden spate of fireball observation after that. Reports came in from so far and wide that it was impossible to do more than sort out the wildly imaginative and put the rest aside to be considered at more leisure, but I noticed that among them were several accounts of fireballs descending into the sea that tallied well with my own observations. So well, indeed, that I could not be absolutely sure they did not derive from my own broadcast. All in all, it appeared to be such a muddle of guesswork, tall stories, third-hand impressions, and thoroughgoing invention that it taught me little. One negative point, however, did strike me. Not a single observer claimed to have seen a fireball descend on land. Ancillary to that, not a single one of those descending on water had been observed from the shore. All had been noticed from ships or from aircraft well out to sea. For a couple of weeks, reportings of sightings in groups, large or small, continued to pour in. The skeptics were weakening, only the most obstinate were still maintaining that they were hallucinations. Nevertheless, we learned nothing more about them than we had known before. No pictures. So often it seemed to be the case of the things you see when you don't have a gun. But the then flock of them came up against a fellow who did have a gun. Literally. The fellow in this case happened to be the USS Tuskegee, a carrier. The message from Caraco that a flight of 8 fireballs was headed directly towards her reached her when she was lying off San Juan, Puerto Rico. The captain breathed a short hope that they would commit a violation of the territory and made his preparations. Fireballs, true to type, kept on in a dead straight line which would bring them across the island and almost over the ship herself. The captain watched her approach on his radar with great satisfaction. He waited until the technical violation was indisputable. Then he gave the word to release 6 guided missiles at 3-second intervals and went on to deck to watch against the darkling sky. Through his glasses, he watched 6 of the red dots change as they burst, one after another, into big white puffs. Well, that settles them, he observed complacently. Now it's going to be mighty interesting to see who beats, he added, as he watched the 2 remaining red dots dwindle away to the northward. But the days passed and nobody beat. Nor was there any decrease in the number of fireball reports. For most people, such as a policy of masterly silence pointed only one way, and they begin to consider their responsibility as good as proved. In the course of the following week, 2 more fireballs that had been incautious enough to pass within range of the experimental station at Wilmer paid for that temerity, and 3 others were exploded by a ship off Kodiak after flying across Alaska. Washington, in a note of protest to Moscow regarding repeated territorial violations, ended by observing that in several cases where drastic action had been taken, they regretted the distress that must have been caused to the relatives of the crews aboard the craft, but that responsibility lay at the door not of those who dealt with the craft, but those who sent them out under orders which transgressed international agreements. The Kremlin, after a few days of gestation, produced a rejection of the protest. It proclaimed itself unimpressed by the tactics of attributing one's own crime to another, and went on to state that its own weapons, recently developed by Russian scientists for the defense of peace, would have now destroyed more than 20 of these crafts over Soviet territory, and would, without hesitation, give the same treatment to any others detected in our work of espionage. The situation thus remained unresolved. The non-Russian world was, by and large, divided sharply into 2 classes, those who believed every Russian pronouncement and those who believed none. For the first class, no question arose. Faith was firm. The second interpretation was less easy. Was one to deduce, for instance, that the whole thing was a lie? Or merely that when the Russians claimed to have accounted for 20 fireballs, they had in fact only exploded 5 or so? The uneasy situation, constantly punctuated by an exchange of notes, drew out over months. Fireballs were undoubtedly more numerous than they had been, but just how much more numerous, or more active, or more frequently reported was difficult to assess. Every now and then a few more were destroyed in various parts of the world, and from time to time, too, it would be announced that a number of capitalistic fireballs had been effectively shown the penalties that awaited those who conducted espionage upon the territory of only true people's democracy. Public interest must feed to keep alive, and as novelty waned, an era of explaining away set in. Nevertheless, in Admiralty and Air Force headquarters all over the world, these notes and reports came together. Courses were plotted on charts. Gradually, a pattern of a kind began to emerge. At EBC, I was still regarded as a natural sifting place for anything to do with fireballs, and though the subject was dead mutton for the moment, I kept up my files in case it should revive. Meanwhile, I contributed in a small way to the building up of the bigger picture by passing along to the authorities such snippets of information as I thought might interest them. In due course, I found myself invited to the Admiralty to be shown some of the results. It was the Captain Winters who welcomed me there, explaining that while I should be shown was not exactly an official secret, it was preferred that I should not make public use of it yet. When I had agreed to that, he started to bring out maps and charts. First was a map of the world hatched over the fine lines, each numbered and dated in minute figures. At first glance, it looked as if a spider's web had been applied to it, and here and there were clusters of little red dots, looking much like the monkey spiders who had spun it. Captain Winters picked up a magnifying glass and held it over the area southeast of the Azores. "There's your first contribution," he told me. Looking through it, I presently distinguished one red dot with a figure 5 against it, and the date and time when Phyllis and I had leaned over the Guinevere's rail watching the fireballs vanish into steam. There were quite a number of other red dots in the area, each labeled, and more of them were strung out to the northeast. "Each of these dots represent the descent of a fireball?" I asked. "One or more. The lines, of course, are only for those of which we had good enough information to plot before us. What do you think of it?" "Well," I told him, "my first reaction is to realize there must have been a devil a lot more of them than I ever imagined. The second is to wonder why in thunder they should group in spots like that. Ah, now stand back from the map a bit, narrow your eyes and get a light and shade impression." I did and saw what he meant. "Areas of concentration," he said. He nodded. 5 major ones and a number of lesser. A dense one to the southwest of Cuba, another 600 miles south of the Cocos Island, heavy concentrations off the Philippines, Japan, and the Aleutians. I'm not going to pretend that proportions of density are right. In fact, I'm pretty sure they are not. For instance, you can see a number of courses converging towards an area northeast of the Falklands, but only 3 red dots there. It very likely means simply that there are precious few people around those parts to observe them. Anything else strike you? I shook my head, not seeing what he was getting at. He produced a bathymetric chart and lay it beside the first. I looked at it. "All the concentrations are in deep water areas," I suggested. "Exactly. There aren't many reports of descents where the depth is less than 4,000 fathoms, and none at all where there's less than 2,000. I thought that over without getting anywhere. "So, just what?" I inquired. "Exactly," he said again. "So what?" We contemplated the proposition a while. All descents, no reports of any coming up. He brought out maps on a large scale of the various main areas. After we had studied them a bit, I asked, "Have you any idea at all what all this means, or wouldn't you tell me if you had?" "Oh, on the first part of that, we only have a number of theories, all unsatisfactory for one reason or another. So the second doesn't really arise." "What about the Russians?" "Nothing to do with them. As a matter of fact, they're all a lot more worried about it than we are. Suspicion of capitalists being part of their mother's milk, they simply can't shake themselves clear of the idea that we must be at the bottom of it somehow, and they just can't figure out either what the game can possibly be. But what both we and they are perfectly satisfied about is that the things are not natural phenomena, nor are they random. And you know, if there were any other country pulling it. Bound to, not a doubt of it." We considered the charts again in silence. "The other obvious question, of course, what do they seem to be doing?" "Yes," he said. "Meaning, no clue? They come, maybe they go, but certainly they come, that's about all." I looked down at the maps, the crisscrossing lines and the red dotted areas. "Are you doing anything about it, or shouldn't I ask?" "Oh, that's why you're here. I was coming around to that," he told me. We're going to try an inspection. Just at the moment, it's not considered to be a matter for direct broadcast, nor even for publication, but there ought to be a record of it, and we shall need one ourselves, so if you people happen to find interested enough to send you along with some gear for the job." "Where would it be?" I inquired. He circled his finger around an area. My wife has a passionate devotion to tropical sunshine, the West Indian kind in particular," I said. "Well, I seem to remember that your wife has written some pretty good documentary scripts," she remarked. And it's the kind of thing EBC might be very sorry about afterwards if they missed it, I reflected. Not until we had made our last call and were well out of sight of land were we allowed to see the large object which rested in a specially constructed cradle aft. When the lieutenant commander in charge of technical operations ordered the shrouded tarpaulin to be removed, there was quite an unveiling ceremony. But the mystery revealed was something of an anticlimax. It was simply a sphere of metal some 10 feet in diameter. The various parts of it were set cylinder porthole-like windows. At the top, it swelled into a protuberance which formed a massive lug. The lieutenant commander, after regarding it a while with the eye of a proud mother, addressed us in the manner of a lecturer. The instrument that you now see, he said impressively, is what we call the bathoscope. He allowed for an interval for appreciation. Didn't BB... I whispered to Phyllis. No, she said, that was the bathysphere. Oh, I said. It's been constructed, he went on, to resist a pressure approaching 2 tons to the square inch, giving a theoretical floor of 1,500 fathoms. In practice, we do not propose to use it at a greater depth than 1,200 fathoms, thus providing for a safety factor of something over 600 pounds to the square inch. Even at this, it would be considered to surpass the achievements of Dr. Beebe, who descended a little over 500 fathoms, and Barton, who reached a depth of 750 fathoms. He continued in his vein for a time, leaving me somewhat behind. When he seemed to have run down for a bit, I said to Phyllis, I can't think in all these fathoms. What is it in God's feet? She consulted her notes. The depth they intend to go is 7,200 feet. The depth they could go is 9,000. Either of them sounds an awful lot of feet. Phyllis in some ways more precise and practical. 7,200 feet is just over a mile and a third, he said. The pressure would be a little more than a ton and a third. That's my continuity, girl, I said. I don't know where I'd be without you. I looked at the bathoscope. All the same, I added doubtfully. What? She asked. Well, that chap at the Admiralty, Winters, he was talking in terms of 4 or 5 tons pressure, meaning presumably 4 or 5 miles down. I turned to the lieutenant commander. How deep is it where we're bound for? I asked him. It's an area called Cayman Trench, between Jamaica and Cuba. In parts it reaches nearly 4,000. But, I began, frowning. Fathoms, dear. Getting on for 24,000 feet. Oh, well that'll be your something like 4.5 miles? Yes, she said again. Oh, I said, again. He returned to his public address manner. That, he told the assembled crowd of us, is the present limit of our ability to make direct visual observations. However, he paused to make a gesture somewhat in the manner of a conjurer towards a party of sailors, and watched while they pulled the tarpaulin from another, similar but smaller sphere. Here, he continued, we have a new instrument which we hope will be able to make observations at something like twice the depth attainable by the bathoscope, perhaps even more. It's entirely automatic. In addition to registering pressures, temperatures, currents, and so on, transmitting the readings to the surface, it's equipped with 5 small television cameras, 4 of them giving all-around horizontal coverage, and 1 transmitting a view vertically beneath the sphere. This instrument, continued with another voice in good imitation of his own, we call the telebath. Fastiousness could not put a man like Commander off his stroke. He continued his lecture, but the instrument had been christened, and telebath it remained. 3 days after we reached our position were occupied with tests and adjustments of both the instruments. In one test, Phyllis and I were allowed to make a dive of 300 feet or so, cramped up in the bathoscope. I just got to get a feel of it. It gave no envy of anyone making a deeper dive. Then, with all the gear fully checked, the real descent was announced for the morning of the 4th day. Soon after sunrise, we were clustering around the bathoscope where it rested in its cradle. The 2 naval technicians, Wiseman and Trant, who were to make the descent, wriggled themselves in through a narrow hole that was the entrance. The warm clothing they would need in the depths was handed in after them, for they could never have squeezed in wearing. Then, following the packets of food and the vacuum flasks of hot drinks, they made their final checks and gave their okays. The circular entrance plug was swung over by hoist, screwed gradually down into its seating, and bolted fast. The bathoscope was hoisted outboard and hung there, swinging slightly. One of the men inside switched on his hand television camera, and we ourselves, as seen from within the instrument, appeared on the screen. "Okay," said a voice in the loudspeaker. "Lower away." The winch began to turn. The bathoscope descended, and the water lapped at it. Presently, it disappeared from sight beneath the surface. The descent was a long business which I do not propose to describe in detail. Frankly, as seen on the screen in the ship, it was a pretty boring affair to the non-initiated. Life in the sea appears to exist in fairly well-defined levels. In the better inhabited strata, the water is full of plankton, which behaves like a continuous dust storm and obscures everything but creatures that approach very closely. At other levels where there is no plankton for food, there are consequently few fish. In addition to the tediousness of very limited views or dark emptiness, continuous attention to the screen that is linked with a slightly swinging and twisting camera has a dizzying effect. Both Phyllis and I spent much of the time during the descent with our eyes shut, relying on the loud-speaking telephone to draw our attention to anything interesting. Occasionally, we slipped on deck for a cigarette. There we could scarcely have been a better day for the job. The sun beat ferociously down on the decks that were occasionally sluiced with water to cool them off. The ensign hung limp, barely stirring. The sea stretched out flat to meet the dome of the sky, which showed only one low bank of cloud to the north, over Cuba, perhaps. There was scarcely a sound either, except for the muffled voice of the loudspeaker in the mess, the quiet drone of the winch, and from time to time the voice of a deck hand calling the tally of fathoms. The group sitting in the mess scarcely spoke. They left that to the men now far below. At intervals, the commander would ask, "All in order below there?" And simultaneously, two voices would reply, "Aye, aye, sir." Once a voice inquired, "Did BB have an electrically heated suit?" Nobody seemed to know. "I take my hat off to him if he didn't," said the voice. The commander was keeping a sharp eye on the dials as well as watching the screen. "Half mile coming up. Check," he said. The voice from below counted. 438, 439, now. "Half mile, sir." The winch went on turning. There wasn't much to see. Occasional glimpses of school fish hurried off into the muck. A voice complained, "Sure, as I get the camera to one window, a damn great fish comes and looks in at another." 500 fathoms, you're passing BB now," said the commander. "Bye-bye, BB," said the voice. "But it goes on looking much the same." Presently, the same voice said, "More life around just here. Plenty of squid, large and small. You can probably see 'em. There's something out this way keeping on the edge of the light. A big thing I can't quite... Might be a giant squid. No, my God, it can't be a whale. Not down here." "Improbable, but not impossible," said the commander. "Well, in that case, it's sheared off now. Anyway, gosh, we mammals do get around a bit, don't we?" In due course, the moment arrived when the commander announced, "Passing Barton now," and then added with an unsuspected change of manner, "From now on, it's all yours, boys. Sure you're quite happy there? If you're not perfectly satisfied, you're only to say." "That's all right, sir. Everything's functioning okay. We'll go on." Up on the deck, the winch droned steadily. 1 mile coming up," announced the commander. When that has been checked, he asked, "How are you feeling now?" "What's the weather like up there?" asked the voice. "Holding well, flat calm, no swell." Two down below conferred. "We'll go on, sir. Could wait weeks for conditions like this again." "All right, if you're both sure." "We are, sir." "Very good. About 300 fathoms more to go then." There was an interval, then, "Dead," remarked the voice from below. "All black and dead now. Not a thing to be seen. Funny thing the way these levels are quite separate. Ah, now we can begin to see something below. Squids again. Luminous fish. Small shoal there. See? There's... Gosh. Gosh!" He broke off, and simultaneously a nightmare of fishy horror gaped at us from the screen. "One of nature's careless moments," he remarked. We went on talking, and the camera continued to give us glimpses of unbelievable monstrosities, large and small. Presently, the commander announced, "Stopping you now, 1,200 fathoms." He picked up the telephone and spoke to the deck. The wind slowed and then ceased to turn. "That's all, boys," he said. "Huh?" said the voice from below, after a pause. Well, whatever it was we came here to find, we're not finding it. The commander's face was expressionless. Whether he expected tangible results or not, I couldn't tell. I imagined not. In fact, I wondered if any of us there really had. After all, these centers of activity were all deeps, and from that it would seem to follow that the reason must lie at the bottom. The echogram gave the bottom hereabouts is still 3 miles or so below where the two men now dangled. Hello there, Bathoscope, said the commander. We're going to start you up now. Ready? Aye, aye, sir. All set, said the two voices. The commander picked up his telephone. All away there. We could hear the winch start and slowly gather speed. On your way now, all okay? All correct, sir. There was an interval without talk for about 10 minutes or more. Then a voice said, There's something out there. Something big. Can't see it properly. Keep it just on the fringe of the light. Can't be that whale again. Not at this depth. Try to show you. The picture on the screen switched and then steadied. We could see the light rays streaming out through the water and the brilliant speckles of small organisms caught in the beam. At the very limits, there was a suspicion of faintly lighter patch. It was hard to be sure of it. Seems to be circling us. We're spinning a bit too, I think. I'll try. Ah, I got a better glimpse of it then. It's not a whale anyway. There, see it now? This time we could undoubtedly make out a lighter patch. It was roughly oval, but indistinct, but there was nothing to give it scale. Said the voice from below. It's certainly a new one. Could be a fish or maybe something else kind of turtle-shaped. Monster-sized brood anyway. Circling a bit closer now, but I still can't make out any details. Keeping pace with us. Again, the camera showed us a glimpse of the thing as it passed one of the bathoscope's ports, but we were a little wiser. The definition was too poor for us to be sure of anything about it. It was going up now, rising faster than we are, getting beyond our angle of view. Ought to be a window in the top of this thing. Lost it now. Gone somewhere up above us. Maybe it'll... The voice cut off dead. Simultaneous, there was a brief, vivid flash on the screen, and it too went dead. The sound of the winch outside altered as it speeded up. We sat looking at one another without speaking. Phyllis's hand sought mine and tightened on it. The commander started to stretch his hand toward the telephone, changed his mind, and went out without a word. Presently, the winch speeded up still more. It takes quite a time to reel in more than a mile of heavy cable. The party in the mess dispersed awkwardly. Phyllis and I went up in the bows and sat there without talking much. After what seemed a very long wait, the winch slowed down. With common consent, we got up and moved off together. At last, the end came up. We all, I suppose, expected to see the end of the wire rope unraveled, with the strands splayed out, brush-like. They were not. They were melted together, but the main and the commutative cables ended in a blob of fused metal. We all stared at them dumbfounded. In the evening, the captain read the service and 3 volleys were fired over the spot. The weather held and the glass was steady. By noon the next day, the commander assembled us in the mess. He looked ill and very tired. He said briefly and unemotionally, "My orders are to proceed with the investigation using our automatic instrument. If our arrangements and tests can be completed in time, and providing the weather remains favorable, we shall conduct the operation tomorrow morning, commencing as soon as after dawn as possible. I am instructed to lower the instrument to the point of destruction, so there will be no other opportunity for observation." The arrangement in the mess the following morning was different from that on the former occasion. We sat facing a bank of 5 television screens, 4 for the quadrants about the instrument, and 1 viewing vertically beneath it. There was also a movie camera photographing all 5 screens simultaneously for the record. Again, we watched the descent through the ocean layers, but this time instead of a commentary, we had an astonishing assortment of chirpings, raspings, and gruntings picked up by the externally mounted microphones. The deep sea is, in its lower inhabited strata, it seems, a place of hideous cacophony. It was something of a relief when at 3/4 of a mile down, silence fell, and somebody muttered, "Huh?" Said those mics never take the pressure. The display went on, squids sliding upward past the cameras, shoals of fish darting nervously away. Other fish attracted by curiosity, monstrosities, grotesques, huge monsters dimly seen. On and on, a mile down, a mile and a half, 2 miles, 2.5, and then at about that point something came into view which quickened all attention on the screen. A large, uncertain oval shape at the extreme of visibility that moved from screen to screen as it circled round the descending instrument. For 3 or 4 minutes it continued to show on one screen or another, but always tantalizingly ill-defined, and never quite well enough illuminated for one to be certain even of its shape. Then gradually it drifted towards the upper edge of the screen, and presently it was left behind. Half a minute later all the screens went black. Why not praise one's wife? Phyllis can write a thundering good feature script, and this was one of her best. It's too bad that it was not received with the immediate enthusiasm it deserved. When it was finished, we sent it around the Admiralty for checking. A week later, we were asked to call. It was Captain Winters who received us. He congratulated Phyllis on the script, as well he might, even if he had not been so taken with her as he so obviously was. Once we were settled in our chairs, however, he shook his head regretfully. Nevertheless, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to hold it up for a while. Phyllis looked understandably disappointed. She'd worked hard on that script. Not just for Cass, either. She tried to make it a tribute to the two men, Wiseman and Trant, who had vanished from the bathtub. She looked down at her toes. I'm sorry, said the captain, but I did warn your husband that it wouldn't be up for immediate release. Phyllis looked up at him. Why? She asked. That was something Ike was equally anxious to know about. My own recordings of the preparation of the brief descent we both made in the bathscope, and of various aspects that were not on the official tape record of the dive, have been put into cold storage too. I'll explain what I can. We certainly owe you that, said Captain Winters. He sat down and leaned forward, elbows on knees, fingers interlaced between them, and looked at us both in turn. The crux of the thing, and of course you will both have realized that long ago, is those fused cables. Imagination staggers a bit at the thought of a creature capable of snapping through steel hawsers. All the same, it might just conceivably admit the possibility. When, however, it comes up against the suggestion that there's a creature capable of cutting through them like an acetylene flame, it recoils. It recoils, and it definitely rejects. Both of you saw what happened to those cables, and I think you must agree that in their condition opens a whole new aspect. A thing like that is not just a hazard of deep-sea diving, and we want to know more about just what kind of hazard it is before we give a release on it. We talked it over for a little time. The captain was apologetic and understanding, but he had his orders. Honestly, Captain Winters, and off the record if you like, have you any idea what can be done? What could have done it? He shook his head. On or off the record, Mrs. Watson? I think no explanation of the approach is being possible, and though this is not for publication, I doubt whether anyone else in the service has an idea either. And so, with the affair left in that unsatisfactory state, we parted. The prohibition, however, lasted a shorter time than we expected. A week later, just as we were sitting down to dinner, he telephoned. Phyllis took the call. Oh, hello, Miss Watson. I'm glad it's you. I have some good news for you, Captain Winter's voice said. I've just been talking to your EBC people and given them okay, so far as we are concerned, to go ahead with that feature of yours and the whole story. Phyllis thanked him for the news. But what's happened? She added. The story's broken anyway. They hear it on the 9 o'clock news tonight and see it in tomorrow's papers. In the circumstances, it seemed to me that you ought to be free to take your chance as soon as possible. Their lordship saw the point, in fact, that they would like the feature to go out as soon as possible. So there it is, and the best of luck to you. Phyllis thanked him again and hung up. Now, what do you suppose could have happened? He inquired. We had to wait until 9 o'clock to find that out. The notice on the news was scanty, but sufficient from our point of view. It reported simply that an American naval unit conducting research into deep-sea conditions somewhere off the Philippines had suffered the loss of a depth chamber with its crew of 2 men. Almost immediately afterwards, EBC came through on the telephone with a lot of talk about priorities and altered program schedules and available cast. Audio assessment told us late that feature had rated an excellent reception figure. Coming so soon after the American announcement, we hit the peak of popular interest. Their lordships were pleased too, and gave them an opportunity of showing that they did not have to follow the American lead. Though I still think there's no need to make a U.S. a present of first publicity. Anyway, in view of what has followed, it don't suppose it greatly matters. Phyllis rewrote a part of the script, making greater play with the fusing of the cables than before. The flow of correspondence came in, but when all the tentative explanations and suggestions had been winnowed, none of us it was any wiser than before. Perhaps it would scarcely be expected that we should be. Our listeners had not even seen the maps, and at this stage it had not occurred to the general public that there could be any link between the diving catastrophes and the somewhat demode topic of fireballs. But if, as it seemed, the Royal Navy was disposed simply to sit still for a time, ponder the problem theoretically, the U.S. Navy was not. Deviously, we heard that they were preparing to send a second expedition to the same spot where their loss had occurred. We promptly applied to be included and were refused. How many other people applied? I don't know, but enough of them to allocate a second small craft. We couldn't get a place on that either. All space was reserved for their own correspondents and commentators who would cover for Europe too. Well, it was their own show, they were paying for it. All the same, I'm sorry we missed it because though we did think it likely they would lose their apparatus again, it never crossed our minds that they might lose their ship as well. About a week after it happened, one of the NBC men who had been covering it came over. We more or less shanghaied him for lunch in the personal dough. Never saw anything like it, he said. But if ever lightning were to strike upward from the sea, I guess that's about the way it'd look. Sparks raining around all around the ship for a few seconds, and then she blew up. I never heard anything like that, Phyllis said. It certainly isn't on the record, he agreed, but there has to be a first time. Not very satisfactory, Phyllis commented. He looked us over. Seeing that you two were on that British fishing party, do I take you know why we were there? I'd not be surprised, I told him. He nodded. Well, look, I'm told it isn't possible to persuade a high charge, say a few million volts, to run up an insulated howitzer in seawater, so I must accept that. It's not my department. All I say is that if it were possible, then I guess the effect might be quite a bit like what we saw. There'd be insulated cables too, to the cameras, microphones, thermometers, and things, Phyllis said. Sure, and there was an insulated cable relaying the TV to our ship, but it couldn't carry that charge and burned out, which was a darn good thing for us. That would make it look to me like it followed the main howitzer. If it didn't so happen, the physics boys won't have it. There's no alternative suggestions? I asked. Oh, sure, several. Some of them could sound quite convincing to a fellow who hadn't seen it happen. You're right, this is very queer indeed, Phyllis said, reflectively. The NBC man looked at her. Nice British understatement, but it's queer enough even without me, he said modestly. However, they explained this away. The physics boys are still stumped on those fused cables, because whatever this may be, those cable severances couldn't have been accidental. On the other hand, all that way down, all that pressure, Phyllis said. He shook his head. I'm making no guesses. I'd want more data than we've got, even for that. Could be we'll get it before long. We looked questioningly. He lowered his voice. Seeing you're in this tube, it's strictly under your hats. They got a couple more probes lined up right now, but no publicity this time. The last lot had a nasty taste. Where? We asked, simultaneously. One off the Aleutian someplace, the other in a deep spot in the Guatemala basin. What's your folks doing? We don't know, he said honestly. He shook his head. Always kind of close, your people, he said sympathetically. And close they remained. During the next few weeks, we kept our ears uselessly wide open for news of either of the two investigations, but it was not until the NBC man was passing through London again a month later that we learned anything. We asked him what had happened. He frowned. Off Guatemala, they drew a blank. Ships south of the Aleutians were transmitted by radio while the dive was in progress. Cut out suddenly. He reported it as lost with all hands. Official cognizance of these matters remained underground, and that can be considered an acceptable term for their deep-sea investigations. Every now and then we would catch a rumor which showed that the interest had not been dropped. From time to time, a few apparently isolated items could, when put in conjunction, be made to give hints. Our naval contacts preserved an amiable evasiveness, and we found that our opposite numbers across the Atlantic were doing little better with their naval sources. The consoling aspect was that if they had been making any progress, we should most likely have heard of it, so we took silence to mean that they were stalled. Public interest in fireballs was down to zero, and few people troubled to send in reports of them anymore. I still kept my files going, though they were not so unrepresentative that I could not tell how far the apparently low incidence was real. As far as I knew, the two phenomena had never so far been publicly connected, and presently both were allowed to lapse unexplained like any silly season sensation. In the course of the next 3 years, we ourselves lost interest almost to a vanishing point. Other matters occupied us. This was work of our son, William, and his death, 18 months later. To help Phyllis get over that, I wangled myself a traveling correspondence series, sold the house, and for a time, we wrote. In theory, the appointment was simply mine. In practice, most of the gloss and finish on the scripts which pleased the EDC were Phyllis's, and most of the time when she wasn't dolling up my stuff, she was working on scripts of her own. When we came back home, it was an enhanced prestige, a lot of material to work up, and feeling of being set on a smooth, steady course. Almost immediately, the Americans lost a cruiser off the Marines. The report was scanty, an agency message, slightly blown up locally, but there was something about it, just a kind of feeling. When Phyllis read it in the newspaper, it struck her too. She pulled up the atlas and considered the marinas. Pretty deep around 3 sides of them, she said. The report's not handled quite the regular way. I can't exactly put my finger on it, but the approach is a bit off the line somehow. I agreed. We'd better try the grapevine, Phyllis decided. We did, without result. It wasn't that our sources were holding out on us. There seemed to be a blackout somewhere. We got no further than the official handout. This cruiser, the Keweenaw, had, in fair weather, simply gone down. 20 survivors had been picked up. There had been an official inquiry. Possibly there was. I never heard the outcome. The incident was somehow overlaid with the inexplicable sinking of a Russian ship engaged in some task never specified, to eastward of the Kurils, that string of islands to the south of Kamchatka. Since it was axiomatic that any Soviet misadventure must be attributable in some way to capitalist jackals or reactionary fascist hyenas, this affair assumed an importance which quite eclipsed the American loss, and the acrimonious innuendos went on echoing for some time. In the noise of vituperation, the mysterious disappearance of the survey vessel Utz Karpen in the Southern Ocean went almost unnoticed outside of her native Norway. Several others followed, but I no longer have my records to give me the details. It is my impression that quite a half a dozen vessels, all seemingly engaged in ocean research in one way or another, had vanished before the Americans suffered again off the Philippines. This time they lost their destroyer, and with it their patience. The ingenious announcement that since the water about Bikini was too shallow for a contemplated series of deep-water atomic bomb tests, the locale of these experiments would be shifted westward by a little matter of 1,000 miles, or so, maybe possibly having deceived a portion of the general public, but in radio and newspaper circles it touched off a scramble for assignments. Phyllis and I had better standing now, and we were lucky too. We flew out there, and a few days later we formed part of the conemployment of a number of ships flying at a strategic distance from the point where the Keweenaw had gone down off the marina. I can't tell you what that specifically designed depth bomb looked like, for we never saw it. All we were allowed to see was a raft supporting a kind of semi-spherical metal hut which contained the bomb itself, and all we were told was that it was much like one or more of the regular types of atomic bomb, but with a massive casing that would resist the pressure, yet 5 miles deep if necessary. At first light of the day of the test, a tug took the raft in tow, and chugged away over the horizon with it. From then on, we had to observe by means of unmanned television cameras mounted on floats. In this way, we saw the tug cast off the raft and put on full speed. Then there was an interval while the tug hurried out of harm's way, and the raft pursued a calculating drift towards the exact spot where the Keweenaw had disappeared. A hiatus lasted for some 3 hours, with the raft looking motionless on the screen. Then a voice through the loudspeaker told us that the release would take place in approximately 30 minutes. It continued to remind us at intervals till the time was short enough for it to start counting in reverse, slowly and calmly. There was a complete hush as we stared at the screens and listened to the voice. 3, 2, 1, now! On the last word, the rocket sprang from the raft, trailing red smoke as it climbed. "Bomb away," said the voice. We waited. For a long time, as it seemed, everything was intensely still. Around the vision screens, no one spoke. Every eye was on one or other of the frames which showed the raft calmly afloat on the blue, sunlit water. There were no sign that anything had occurred there, save the plume of red smoke drifting slowly away. For the eye and the ear, there was utter serenity. For the feelings, a sense that the whole world held its breath. Then it came. The plastered surface of the sea suddenly belched into a vast white cloud which spread and boiled as it writhed upward. A tremor passed through the ship. We left the screens and rushed to the ship's side. Already the cloud was above our horizon. It still writhed and convolved upon itself in a fashion that was somehow obscene as it climbed monstrously up the sky. Only then did the sound reach us in a buffeting roar. Much later, the amazingly delayed, we saw the dark line which was the first wave of turbulent water rushing toward us. That night we shared a dinner table with Mallerby of the Tidings and Binnell of the Senate. This was Phyllis's show, and she had them more or less where she wanted them between the entree and the roast. They argued a while along familiar lines, but after a while the name Barker began to creep up with increasing frequency and some acrimony. Apparently this Barker had some theory about deep-sea disturbances which had not come our way, and did not seem to be held in great repute by either party. Phyllis was on it like a hawk. One would never have guessed that she was utterly in the dark from the judicial way she said, "Surely the Barker line can't be altogether dismissed," frowning a little as she spoke. It worked. In a little time we were adequately briefed on the Barker view, and without either of them guessing that as far as we were concerned, he had come into it for the first time. The name of Alistair Barker was not, of course, entirely unknown to us. It was that of an eminent geographer, a name customarily followed by several groups of initials. However, the information on him that Phyllis now prompted forth was something quite new to us. When we ordered and assembled, it amounted to this. Almost a year earlier, Barker had presented a memorandum to the Admiralty in London. Because he was Barker, it succeeded in getting itself read at some quite important levels, though the gist of its argument was as follows. Fused cables and the electrification of certain ships must be regarded as indisputable evidence of intelligence at work in certain deeper parts of the ocean. Conditions such as pressure, temperature, perpetual darkness, etc. And those reasons made it inconceivable that any intelligent form of life could have evolved there, and this statement he backed with several convincing arguments. It was to be assumed that no nation was capable of constructing mechanisms that could operate at such depths as indicated by the evidence, nor would they have any purpose in attempting to do so. But if intelligence in the depths was not indigenous, then it must have come from somewhere. Also, it must be embodied in some form able to withstand a pressure of tons to the square inch, 2 tons certainly from present evidence, probably 5 or 6 tons, even 7 tons if it was capable of existing in the very deepest deeps. Now, was there anywhere else on Earth where a mobile form could find conditions of such pressure to evolve in? Clearly, there was not. Very well, then it could not have evolved on Earth, it must have evolved somewhere else, say, a large planet where the pressures were normally very high? If so, how did it cross space and arrive here? Barker then recalled attention to the fireballs which had aroused so much speculation a few years ago, and were still occasionally to be seen. None of these had been known to descend on land, none, indeed, had been known to descend anywhere but in areas of very deep water. Moreover, such of them had been struck by missiles and exploded with such violence as to suggest they had been retaining a very high degree of pressure. It was significant also that these fireball globes invariably sought the only regions of the Earth which high-pressure conditions compatible with movement were available. Therefore, Barker deduced that we were in the process, while almost unaware of it, of undergoing a species of interplanetary immigration. If he were to be asked the source of it, he would point to Jupiter as being most likely to fulfill the conditions of pressure. His memorandum had concluded with the observation that such an incursion need not necessarily be regarded as hostile. It seemed to him that the interests of a type of creation which existed at 15 pounds to a square inch were unlikely to overlap seriously with those of a form which required several tons per square inch. He advocated, therefore, that the greatest efforts should be made to develop some means of making a sympathetic approach to the new dwellers in our depths, with the aim of facilitating exchange of science, using the word in its widest sense. The views expressed by their lordships upon these elucidations and suggestions were not publicly reported. It is known, however, that not long interval passed before Barker withdrew his memorandum from their unsympathetic desks, and shortly afterward presented it for personal consideration to the editor of the Tidings. Undoubtedly, the Tidings, in returning it to him, expressed itself with its usual tact. It was only for the benefit of his professional brethren that the editor remarked, "This newspaper has managed to exist for more than 100 years without a comic strip, and I see no reason to break that tradition now." In due course, the memorandum appeared in front of the editor of the Senate, who glanced at it, called for a synopsis, lifted his eyebrows, and dictated an urban regret. Subsequently, it ceased to circulate and was known only by word of mouth within a small circle. "The best you can say of it," said Mallerby, "is that he does include more factors than anyone else has, and that anything includes even most of the factors is bound to be fantastic. We may decry it, but for all that, until something better turns up, it's the best we have." "That's true," said Bennell, "but whatever the top naval men think about Barker, it's clear enough that they too must be assuming for some time there is something intelligent down there. You don't design and make a special bomb like that all in 5 minutes, you know. Anyway, whether the Barker theory is sheer hot air or not, he lost his main point. The bomb was not the amiable and sympathetic approach that he advocated." Mallory paused and shook his head. "I met Barker several times. He's a civilized, liberal-minded man. The usual trouble of liberally-minded men is they think others are too. He had an interested, inquired mind. He never grasps what the average mind, when it encounters something new, is scared, and says, better smash it or suppress it quick. Well, he's just another demonstration of the average mind at work." But Bennell objected. "If, as you say, it's officially believed that these ships' losses have been caused by an intelligence, then there's something to be scared about, and you can't put today's affair down as nothing stronger than retaliation." Mallerby shook his head again. "My dear Bennell, I not only can, but I do. Suppose now that something were to come dangling down to us on a rope out of space, and suppose that thing were emitted rays on a wavelength that acutely discomforted us, perhaps even caused us physical pain. What should we do? I suggest that the first thing we should do would be to snip the rope and put it out of action. Then we should examine the strange object and find out what we could do about it. And if more of the same followed, then we should forthwith take what steps we could to discourage them. And this might be done simply in the spirit of ending a nuisance, or might be done with some animosity and regarded as retaliation. Now, would it be we or the thing above that was to blame? It is difficult to imagine any kind of intelligence that would not resent what we've just done. If this were the only deep where trouble has occurred, there might well be no intelligence left to resent it. But this isn't the only place, as you know, not by any means. So what form that very natural resentment will take remains for us to see. You think there really will be some kind of response then? Phyllis asked. He shrugged. To take up my analogy again, suppose that some violently destructive agency were to descend from space upon one of our cities. What shall we do? Well, what could we do? asked Phyllis, reasonably enough. We could turn the backroom boys onto it, and if it happened a few more times, we should soon be giving the backroom boys full priorities. No, he shook his head. No, I'm afraid Barker's idea of fraternization never had the chance of a flea in a furnace. That was, I think, very likely as true as Mallerby made it sound. But if there was a chance at all, it was gone by the time we reached home. Somehow, and apparently overnight, the public had put several twos together at last. The half-hearted attempt to represent the depth bomb as one of the series of tests had broken down altogether. The vague fatalism with which the loss of Kiowa and the other ships had been received was succeeded by a burning sense of outrage, a satisfaction that the first step in vengeance had been taken, and a demand for more. The atmosphere was similar to that of a declaration of war. Yesterday's phlegmatics and skeptics were, all of a sudden, fervent preachers of a crusade against against whatever it was that had the insolent temerity to interfere with the freedom of the sea. Agreement on that cardinal point was virtually unanimous, but from that hub speculation radiated in every direction that not only fireballs, but every other unexplained phenomenon that had occurred for years was in some way attributed to, or at least connected with, the mystery in the deeps. The wave of worldwide excitement struck us when we stopped off for a day at Karachi on our way home. The place was bubbling with tales of sea serpents and visitations from space. It was clear that whatever restrictions Barker might have put on the circulation of his theory, a good many million people had now arrived at a similar explanation by other route. This gave me the idea of telephoning to the EBC in London to find out if Barker himself would now unbend enough for an interview. It had told me that the others had had the same idea, and that Barker would be giving a restricted press conference on Friday. They would do their best to get us in on it. They did, and we arrived back in London with a couple hours to spare before it took place. Alistair Barker was recognizable from his photographs, but they had not done him justice. The main facial architecture, with its rather full, middle-aged infant quality, the broad eyebrows, the lock of gray hair tending to stray forward, the shapes of the nose and the mouth were all familiar, but the camera, by its inability to convey the liveliness of his eyes, the mobility of the mouth and the whole face, the sparrow-like quality of his movements, had falsified him. One of those so unrestful small boys grown up, observed Phyllis, studying him before the affair began. For some minutes longer people continued to arrive and settle down, then Barker stepped up to the table in front. The way he did it managed to convey that he had not come there to conciliate. When the babble had died, he stood looking us over for some seconds. Then he spoke without script or notes. I don't suppose for a moment that this meeting is going to be useful. However, I did not call it, and I'm not concerned now whether I get good press or not. A couple years ago, I should have welcomed the chance of this publicity. 1 year ago, I attempted to achieve it, though my hopes that we might be able to deflect a possible course of events was no more slight even then. I find it somewhat ironical, therefore, you should have honored me in this way now, then they have become non-existent. A version of my arguments, very likely a garbled one, may have reached you, but I will summarize them now so that at least we shall know what we are talking about. The summary differed little from the version we had already heard. At the end of it he paused. Now, your questions. At this distance in time I cannot pretend to remember who asked what questions, but I recall that the first few fatuous ones were slapped down pretty sharply. Then someone asked, Dr. Barker, I seem to recall that originally you made some deliberate play with the word immigration, but just now you spoke of invasion. You have changed your mind? It has been changed for me, Barker told him. For all I know, it may have been in intention just a peaceful immigration, but the evidence is that it is not so now. So, said somebody else, You're telling us that this is our old blood chiller, the interplanetary war come at last. It might be put that way by the facetious, agreed Barker, calmly. It is certainly an invasion and from some place unknown. He paused. Almost equally remarkable, he went on, is the fact that in this sensation-seeking world it has managed to take place almost unrecognized for what it is. Only now, several years after its inception, is it starting to be taken seriously. It doesn't look like an interplanetary war to me now, whatever it is, the voice remarked. That, remarked Barker, I would ascribe to two main causes. First, constipation of the imagination, and secondly, the influence of the late Mr. H.G. Wells. One of the troubles about writing a classic is that it sets a pattern of thinking. Everybody reads it, with the result that everybody thinks he knows exactly the form which an interplanetary invasion not only ought to, but must take. If a mysterious cylinder were to land close to London or Washington tomorrow, we should all of us immediately recognize it as a right and proper subject for alarm. It seems to have been overlooked that Mr. Wells was simply employing one of a number of devices that he might have used for a work of fiction. Still, one might point out that he did not pretend to be laying down a law for the conduct of interplanetary campaigns. And the fact that his choice remains the only prototype for the occurrence in so many minds is better compliment to his skill in writing than it is to those minds' skill in thinking. There can be quite a large variety of invasions against which it would be no good to call up the Marines. This one is much more difficult to come to grips with than Mr. Wells' Martians were. It still remains to be seen whether the weapons we shall have to face will be more or less effective than those we imagined. Someone put in. Alright, say for purposes of discussion that this is an invasion. Now, why would you say have we been invaded? Barker regarded him for a long moment, and then he said, I imagine that why to have been the cry of every invaded party throughout history. But there must be some reason, the questioner persisted. Must there? Well, I suppose in the widest sense there must. But it does not follow from that there is a reason we should understand, even if we knew it. I do not suppose the original Americans had much understanding of the reasons why they were being invaded by the Spaniards. But what you are in fact asking is that I should explain to you the motives that are animating an alien form of intelligence. In modesty, I must decline to make that much of a fool of myself. The way to have found out, if not to have understood perhaps, would have been to get into communication with these things in our deeps. But it would appear that whatever chance there may have once been of that, we have now surely spoiled it. The questioner was not satisfied with that. But if we can't assign a reason, he said, then surely the whole thing becomes very little different from a natural disaster, something like, say, an earthquake or a cyclone. True enough, agreed Barker, and why not? I imagine that it is just so that the bird appears in the insect. Also, for the common people involved in a great war, its distinction from a natural disaster is not very sharp. I know that you have all taught your readers to expect oversimplified explanations of everything, not excluding God himself, in words of one syllable, so go ahead and satisfy their lust for wisdom. No one can contradict you. But if I'm trying to bang your explanations on me, if you try to hang your explanations on me, I'll sue you. I'll go as far as this. I can think of just two human motives for migration across space, if it were possible, on any scale. One would be simple expansion and aggrandizement. The other, flight from intolerable conditions on the home planet. For those things in the deep are certainly not human, whatever they may be. Therefore, their reasons and motives may, but much more likely will not, be similar to human motives. He paused and looked around again. You know, this why business is a waste of breath. If we were to go to another planet and the people we found there promptly threw bombs at us, the why of our going there wouldn't make the least difference. We would simply assume that if we did not take the steps to stop it, we should be exterminated. And there, possibly, we do have some common ground with these things in the deep. The life force, in whatever shape it is embodied, must have collectively or individually the will to survive, or it will soon just cease to be. And it is definitely your opinion that this is a hostile invasion? Someone asked. Barker regarded him with interest. You know, you'd better stay after class. What I say that it is an invasion, that it is hostile now, but it may not have been hostile in intention. And now, he concluded, all I ask is that you convince your readers that this is no stunt, but a very serious matter, Those of you whom editorialized and proprietorial policies permit, of course. What happened, in fact, was that almost all reports presented Bakker as a crackpot, with a kind of implied comment, "This is the sort of thing you might believe if you were a crackpot too, but of course you are not, you are a sensible man." There were signs that the downplaying was not accidental. The public was in a mood in which it would have taken anything, but there was pointed neglect of the opportunity to exploit the situation. Nor, just then, did anything sensational occur to interrupt the soothing process. Then, by degrees, the feeling got about that this was not at all the way anyone had expected an interplanetary war to be, so very likely it was not an interplanetary war after all. From there, of course, it was only a step deciding that it must be Russia. The Russians had all along encouraged with their dictatorate suspicion of capitalistic warmongers. When whispers of the interplanetary notion did in some way penetrate their curtain, they were countered by the statements that A, it was all a lie, a verbal smoke screen to cover the preparations of warmongers, B, that it was true and the capitalists, true to type, had immediately attacked unsuspecting strangers with atom bombs, and C, whether it was true or not, the USSR would fight unswervingly for peace with all the weapons it possessed except germs. The swing continued. People were heard to say, "Huh? That interplanetary stuff? Don't mind telling you I very nearly fell for it at the time, but of course when you start to actually think about it, wonder what the Russian game really is. Must have been something pretty big to make them use A-bombs on it." Thus, in quite a short time, the status quo antebellum hypotheticum was restored, and we were back on the familiar, comprehensible basis of international suspicion. The only lasting result was the marine insurance staying up 1%. A couple of weeks later, we had a little dinner party, with Captain Winters sitting at Phyllis's right hand. They looked to be getting on very well. Afterward, in our domestic privacy, I inquired, "If you aren't too sleepy, how did it go? What did the captain have to say?" "Oh, lots of nice things. Irish blood there, I think. But passing from the really important to matters of mere worldwide interest," I suggest patiently. "He wouldn't let go of much, but what he did say wasn't encouraging. Some of it was rather horrid." "Tell me." "Well, the main situation doesn't seem to have altered a lot on the surface, but they're getting increasingly worried about what's happening below." He didn't actually say that the investigation has made no progress either, but what he did say implied it. He says, for instance, that the atomic bombs were out, for the moment at any rate. You can only use them in isolated places, and even then the radioactivity spreads widely. The fishery experts on both sides of the Atlantic have been raising hell, and saying that it's because of the bombs that some shoals have been failing to turn up in the proper places at the proper times. They've been blaming the bombs for upsetting the ecology, whatever that is, and affecting the migratory habits. But a few of them are saying that the data isn't sufficient to be absolutely sure that it's the bombs that have done it. But something certainly has, and there's been certain serious effects on food supplies. And so, as nobody seems quite clear what the bombs were expected to do, and all they do is to kill and bewilder lots of fish at great expense, they've become unpopular just now. And here's something else. 2 of those bombs they sent down haven't gone off. "Oh," I said, "then what do we infer from that?" "I don't know, but it has them worried, very worried. You see, the way they are set to operate is by pressure at a given depth. Simple and pretty accurate." "Meaning that they never reached the right pressure zone? Must have gotten hung up somewhere on the way down." Phyllis nodded. It made them extremely anxious. "Understandably, too. I did not feel too happy myself if I had mislaid a couple live atom bombs," I admitted. "What else?" 3 cable repair ships have unaccountably disappeared. One of them was cut off in the middle of a radio message. He was known to be grappling for a defective cable at the time. "When was this?" "One about 6 months ago, one about 3 weeks ago, and one last week." "Might not have anything to do with it." "They might not, but everyone's pretty sure they have." "No survivors to tell what happened?" "None." Presently I asked, "Anything more?" "Let me see. Oh yes, they were developing some kind of guided depth missile which would be high explosive, not atomic, but it hasn't been tested yet." I turned to look at her admiringly. "That's the stuff, darling. The real Mata Hari touch." Phyllis ignored that one. "The most important thing is that he's going to give an introduction to Dr. Matet, the oceanographer." I sat up. "But darling, the Oceanographical Society has more or less threatened to excommunicate anybody who deals with after that last script. It's part of their anti-Bakker line." "Well, Mr. Matet happens to be friends of the captain. He's seen his fireball instance maps and he's a half convert. Anyway, we're not convinced Bakkerites, are we? What we think we are isn't necessarily what other people think we are. Still, if he's willing, when can we see?" I hope to see him in a few days' time, Charlie. Don't you think I should? No, but it's sweet you're not to trust me still. But, no, and it's time we went to sleep, she said firmly. The beginning of Phyllis's interview was, she reported, almost standard. E.B.C., said Dr. Matet, raising eyebrows like miniature doormats. I thought Captain Winters said BBC. He was a man with large frame sparingly covered, which gave his head the appearance of a properly belonging to a still larger frame. His tanned forehead was high and well polished back to the crown. He gave one, Phyllis said, a feeling of being overhung. She sighed inwardly and started on a routine justification of the English Broadcasting Company's existence and worked him round gradually until he had reached a position of considering us nice enough people, striving manfully to overcome the disadvantages of being considered a slightly second-class oracle. Then, after making it quite clear that any material he might supply was strictly anonymous in origin, he opened up a bit. The trouble from Phyllis's point of view was that he did it on a pretty academic level, full of strange words and instances which she had to interpret as best she could. The gist of what he had to tell her, however, seemed to be this. A year ago there had begun to be reports of discolorations in certain ocean currents. First observation of the kind had been made in the Kurisho current in the North Pacific, an unusual muddiness flowing northeast, becoming less discernible as it gradually widened out along the west wind drift until it was no longer perceptible to the naked eye. Samples were taken and sent for examination, of course. What do you think the discoloration turned out to be? Said Dr. Matet. Phyllis looked properly expectant. He told her, mainly radiolarian ooze, but with an appreciable percentage of diatomaceous ooze. How very remarkable, Phyllis said, safely. Now, what on earth could produce a result like that? Ah, said Dr. Matet, that is the question. A disturbance on quite remarkable scale. Even in samples taken on the other side of the ocean, off the coast of California, there was still quite a heavy impregnation of both these oozes. He went on and on until Phyllis finally managed to interrupt him. Something then, she said, not only was, but still is going on down there. Something is, he agreed, looking at her. Then with a sudden descent to the vernacular, he added, but to be honest with you, Lord knows what it is. Too much geography, said Phyllis, and too much oceanography, and too much bathography, too much of the ographies, and lucky to escape ichthyology. Tell me, I said. She did, with notes. And, she concluded, I'd like to see anyone scribe a script out of that lot. I said. There's no hms about it. Some kind of ographer might give a talk on it to highbrows and low-listening figures, that even if he were intelligible, where would get anybody? That, I remarked, is the key question each time. But little by little the bits do accumulate. This is another bit. You didn't really expect to come back with the stuff for a whole script anyway. He didn't see this, how this might link up with the rest of it? No, I said it was sort of funny how everything seemed to be happening down in the most inaccessible parts of the ocean lately, and a few things like that, but he didn't rise. Very cautious. I think he was rather wishing he had not agreed to see me, so he stuck to verifiable facts. Eminently no-weedable at first meeting, anyhow. He admitted that might send his reputation the way Bakker's is gone. Look, I said, Bakker must have gotten to know about this as soon as anyone did. He ought to have some views on it, and it might be worth trying to find out what they are. The select press conference of his that we went to was almost an introduction. He went very coy after that, she said doubtfully. Not surprising, really. Still, we weren't among the ones who panted publicly. In fact, we were very objective. Tashi, which of us brings him up? I offered. I'll do it, she said. So I leaned back comfortably in my chair and listened to her going through the opening ceremony of making it clear that she was the EEC. I will say for Bakker that he was proposed his mouthful of the theory and has sold it to himself. He had not backed out of a deal when he found it unpopular. At the same time, he had no great desire to be involved in a further round of controversy when he would be pelted with cheap cracks and drowned in the noise from empty vessels. He made that quite clear when we met. He looked at us earnestly, his head a little on one side, the lock of gray hair hanging slightly forward, his hands clasped together. He nodded thoughtfully and then said, You want a theory from me because nothing you can think of will explain this phenomenon. Very well, you shall have one. I don't suppose you'll accept it, but I do ask if you use it at all to use it anonymously. When people come round to my view again, I shall be ready, but I prefer not to be thought of as keeping my name before the public by letting out sensational dribblings. Is that quite clear? We nodded. We were becoming used to this general desire for anonymity. What we are trying to do, Phyllis explained, is to fit a lot of bits and pieces into a puzzle. If you can show us where one of them should go, we'd be very grateful. If you would rather not have the credit for it, well, that's your own affair. Exactly. Well, you already know my theory of the origin of the deep water intelligences, so we'll not go into that now. We'll deal with their present state, and I deduce that to be this. Having settled the environment best suited to them, the creature's next thoughts would be to develop that environment in accordance with their ideas of what constitutes a convenient, orderly, and eventually civilized condition. They are, you see, in the position of, well, no, they are actually pioneers, colonists. Once they've safely arrived, they set about improving and exploiting their new territory. What we have been seeing is the results of their newly started work on the job. By doing what? I asked. He shrugged his shoulders. How can we possibly tell? But judging by the way we have received them, one would imagine that their primary concern would be to provide themselves some form of defense against us. For this, they would presumably require metals. I suggest to you, therefore, that somewhere down in the Mediano Trench, and also somewhere in the deep, in the southeast of the Cocos Keeling Basin, you would, if you go there, find mining operations now in progress. I glimpsed the reason of his demand for anonymity. But the working of metals in such conditions, I said. How can we guess what technology they may have developed? We ourselves have plenty of techniques for doing things which would at first appear impossible in atmospheric pressure of 15 pounds per square inch. There are also a number of unlikely things we can do underwater. But with pressure of tons and in continual darkness, and I began, the Phyllis cut across me with that decisiveness which warns me to shut up and not argue. Dr. Bacher, she said, you named two particular deeps then. Why was that? He turned from me to her, because that seems to me the only reasonable explanation where those two are concerned. It may be, as Mr. Holmes once remarked to your husband's illustrious namesake, a capital mistake to theorize before one has data, but it is mental suicide to flunk the data one has. I know of nothing, and can imagine nothing, that could produce the effect Dr. Mattet spoke of, except some exceedingly powerful machine by continuous ejection. But, I said, a little firmly, for I get rather tired of being dogged by the ghost of Mr. Holmes, if it is mining as you suggest, then why is the discoloration due to ooze and not grit? Well, firstly, there would be a great deal of ooze to be shifted before one could get at the rock. Immense deposits, most likely, and secondly, the density of the ooze is little more than that of the water, whereas the grit, being heavy, would begin to settle long before it got anywhere near the surface, however fine it might be. Before I could pursue that, Phyllis cut me off again. What about the other places, Doctor? Why mention just those two? I don't say that the others don't also seek to find mining, but I suspect from their locations that they may have another purpose. Which is? Prompted Phyllis, looking at him all girlish expectation. Communications, I think. You see, for instance, close to, though far below, the area where discoloration begins to occur in the equatorial Atlantic lies the Romantic Trench. It's gorged through the submerged mountains of the Atlantic Ridge. Now, when one considers the fact that it forms the only deep link between the eastern and western Atlantic basins, it seems more than just a coincidence that signs of activity should show up there. In fact, it strongly suggests to me that something down below is not satisfied with the natural state of that trench. Quite likely that it's blocked here and there by falls of rock, and maybe that in some parts it's narrow and awkward. Almost certainly, if there were a prospect of using it, it'd be an advantage to clear it of ooze deposits down to a solid bottom. I don't know, of course, but the fact that there's something undoubtedly taking place in that strategic trench leaves me with little doubt that whatever is down there is concerned to improve its method of getting about in the depths, just as we have improved our ways of getting about on the surface. There was a silence while we took in that one and its implications. Phyllis rallied first. And the other two main places, the Caribbean one and the one west of Guatemala, she asked. Barker offered us cigarettes and lit one himself. Well, now, he remarked, leaning back in his chair, doesn't it strike you as probable that, for a creature of the depths, a tunnel connecting the deeps on either side of the isthmus would offer advantages almost identical with those that we ourselves obtained from the existence of the Panama Canal? People may say what they like about Barker, but they can never truthfully claim that Scott's ideas is mean or niggling. What is more, nobody has ever actually proved him wrong. His chief trouble was that he usually provided such large indigestible slabs that they stuck in all gullets, even mine, and I would class myself as a fairly wide gullet type. That, however, was a subsequent reflection. At the climax of the interview, I was chiefly occupied with trying to convince myself that he really meant what he had said, and finding nothing but my own resistance to suggest that he did not. Before we left, he gave us one more thing to think about, too. He said, "Since you're following this along, you've probably heard of 2 atomic bombs that failed to go off." We told him we had. "And have you heard that there were an unsponsored atomic explosion yesterday?" "No. Was it one of them?" "I should very much hope so, because I should hate to think it could be any other. But the odd thing is that though one was lost off the Aleutians and the other in the process of trying to give the Mediana Trench another shake-up, the explosion took place not so far off Guam, 1,200 miles from Midowano. And so surfaces the first phase of Out of the Deeps, where falling stars seed unseen peril, a masterful slow burn of cosmic dread. As mysteries deepen, it reflects Hitchcock's craft of implication over revelation. Wyndham's ordinary protagonist mirror Hitchcock's everyman traps. His TV adaptation of similar tales expanded anthologies to screen. Next in the finale arc, the emergence begins. Did these fireballs intrigue? Comment, like, subscribe. Series 1 finale continues soon. Gay C word. Good night.
Felix Lubeski sails the grid so wide, second life's ocean stories to find, horror and wonders hiding in the deep. Log into SL tonight, no time for sleep. What shall we do with a fantastic story? What shall we do with a fantastic story? What shall we do with a fantastic story? Early on SL tonight. Way, hey, with Felix Lubeski. Way, hey, with Felix Lubeski. Way, hey, with Felix Lubeski. Living the virtual life. Tales from the crypt and secrets untold. Guest hosts arriving, brave and bold. Machine and my magic chills down your spine. Join the chat crew, make the tale shine. What shall we do with a fantastic story? What shall we do with a fantastic story? What shall we do with a fantastic story? Early on SL tonight. Apocalypse rising, agents in disguise. Flop sweat dripping for your eyes. Felix reads them live on the stage so grand. Second life stories, best in the land. Heave-ho, avatars unite. Tune in weekly. Subscribe now. Don't miss the show. Let the stories flow. What shall we do with a fantastic story? What shall we do?